Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Iron Coffins Part 31. How do you mean? I asked the American pilot. You heard me. We will pulverize your U-boat bunkers and industrial facilities, and in a few months... never mind. Yes, I continued where he left off. In a few months, we will repay everything. I don't know what they've told you about us or our potential, but I can assure you one day all your machines will fall from the sky, and that will be the end of the war. I thought of the much discussed new weapons, the jet airplanes, the death rays our scientists were working on intensively. Oh sure, the American replied sarcastically. But what's happening with your U-boats? In the last 6 months, we've sunk the majority. The rest will go the same way. You can't keep going much longer. I was impressed by his knowledge, but also annoyed by his arrogance. What you're saying is nonsense. Who told you this fairy tale that we don't have any more U-boats? Ain't that the truth? Of course not. I myself am proof to the contrary. I just returned from a mission, and I can assure you that many boats are still at sea. And soon, several hundred will be at the front, faster and larger than our current boats. After I had told him this, I felt somehow relieved. But the Yankee put on his skeptical smile again and replied, Listen, let me tell you something. One day you'll think about it, and that day is not too far. Whatever you undertake, it'll be too late. Time's working for us. Only for us. Convinced that he was a typical victim of Allied propaganda, I put my hand on his shoulder and said conciliatorily, You're not as bad as your newspapers claim. I wish you a speedy recovery. One day you'll have to admit that I was right. We both laughed at each other, and I left the hospital. The American lay on the operating table, after which a long convalescence awaited him behind barbed wire. Meanwhile, it had already become daylight, too late or too early to go to bed. I returned to the base, unpacked my suitcase, hung my uniform and civilian suit in a closet, arranged my books on the desk, took one, and began to read. But I couldn't concentrate. I kept hearing the American pilot saying that time was working for them alone, only for them. I reached for the letters from home and read them again. But the voice of the American echoed from the lines of the letters. The air raids, my parents wrote, had significantly increased, and a business friend of my father had fallen victim to one of the attacks. The letters also revealed that Hans, Trudel's husband, had been on vacation, and they had spent a week in the Black Forest, where the nights were still calm. These letters spoke the pure truth, that things were deteriorating rapidly back home as well. And again, I heard the Americans saying that time was working for them. In early November, the shipyard engineers promised to complete extensive repairs on U-230 within 2 weeks. Our old workhorse would then be ready for its next battle with overhauled and partly new organs. But fundamentally, it was the same boat, the same type with which we had started the war. It was still a surface vessel that only occasionally submerged, whether to conduct an underwater attack, evade danger, perform the daily mandatory diving for trim and weight adjustment, or carry out a specific task with the necessary secrecy. The submarine still relied on marching on the surface, searching for, hunting, and attacking convoys. Like our predecessors in the First World War, 30 years ago, we were forced to surface for battery recharging and fresh air intake. However, after the Allies introduced state-of-the-art anti-submarine measures, our old brave boat was no longer up to the radically changed combat conditions. Leadership had rested too long on its laurels without preparing or adapting to the altered situation at sea. For too long, our boats operated without significant design changes against an enemy employing the latest technological advancements in submarine warfare. Almost overnight, our boats became obsolete. Instead of developing the Snorkel in 1940, when the Dutch inadvertently handed us one of their submarines equipped with it, and making it standard equipment on our boats since 1941, instead of critically reassessing the demands of the battle continuously and constructing revolutionary types at the beginning of the war, gradually outfitting the front with the total submarine, old boats were still being launched this fall. We continued to face a crushing defeat on outdated boats against an overwhelming adversary, using highly developed equipment and a debilitating tactic, making our lives in a diving tube hell. As a consolation, I learned that we were to be equipped with 2 new, significantly improved radar warning receivers, devices capable of detecting wavelengths in the low centimeter range. With these devices, we should be able to compete in the race for the advances of electronic warfare. So far, we'd been irrevocably pushed into a defensive position in this field. It was the Allies who dictated the conditions of the battle and the weapons. The next weekend, I turned my back on the harbor and the boat, taking the Friday night express train from Brest to Paris. Upon arrival, I went to the restroom and changed into civilian clothes. As agreed, I met Marguerite under the Eiffel Tower. She wore a blue dress with embroidered flowers. When I kissed her, the furtive glances of our soldiers, clearly jealous of the enthusiastic Frenchwoman, caught my attention. Paris was warm and filled with the scents of autumn. And above all, the sun shone, a sight I had often been forced to avoid at sea. Shortly after my return to Brest, clad in navy blue with nothing indicating that I had been visiting another world, the shipyard completed the overhaul of U-230. I immediately began preparing the boat for our next mission. However, the delivery of the new torpedoes seemed to have encountered difficulties. We received only one acoustic homing torpedo and 8 LUT torpedoes, along with 3 eels of the old type. I also inquired about the availability of a snorkel system, but was met with astonished faces only. None of the shipyard engineers had ever heard of such a device. Nevertheless, the warlike appearance of the boat, the heavy anti-aircraft armament of 8 barrels gave us new confidence. The rapid-fire cannons, the promising new torpedoes, and the new radar warning receiver gave us a good chance of returning to port. One day before setting sail, the captain was unexpectedly ordered to report to High Command. The order must have had something to do with our next mission. After a one-day absence, Siegmann returned and invited us officers to his room. "Gentlemen," he said solemnly, "I'll keep it short. We've been ordered to break through the Strait of Gibraltar. Our future operational area is the Mediterranean." Siegmann paused to gauge the impact of his words. I forced a smile, and my comrades, Friedrich and Riedel, showed surprise. It was widely known that attempting to break through the Strait of Gibraltar had very slim chances of success. But at that time, it didn't really matter where we were going. It was the same everywhere. Our tremendous efforts to reach the enemy encountered fierce resistance. We had our hands full trying not to be bombed, damaged, or sunk. The outcome was always the same. Only the name of the sea would change. But there was also consolation, a reward if we could break through the Strait of Gibraltar. We would be able to operate in the calm waters of the Mediterranean in the future. To ease the tension, I abruptly said, "There are some port cities there that I haven't seen yet. The only difficulty is, how do we get there?" The captain picked up on my cue and continued. "If you, gentlemen, keep the destination of our journey absolutely secret, we have the well-founded prospect of lying on an Italian beach in the sun in January." The ice was broken and our conversation became very lively. However, Siegmann soon dampened our spirits. He reported the loss of 2 boats, U-732 and U-340, which had been intercepted and sunk by the British in early November while attempting to break through the Strait of Gibraltar. U-455, U-264 and U-661, which were also supposed to break the blockade, were heavily damaged and forced to return before reaching the strait. Only 3 out of 8 boats had successfully passed through the strait. Further sinkings in the area west of Spain and Portugal confirmed the strong defense along the approach route. U-566 had been sunk by aircraft near the Spanish coast on October 31st. The same fate befell U-966 on November 10th. However, we never heard from U-134 and U-535, which had been sunk in that area without being able to send a distress signal. These losses gave us a clear picture of what awaited us. In the days of preparing for our journey, the casualty figures continued to rise. By November the 25th, another 15 boats had been destroyed. Thus, the once great and proud U-boat fleet in the Atlantic had been reduced to less than half its strength from the spring. And this despite a constant influx of new and fresh boats from the homeland. The English-American success in November were only met with 31,000 tons of Allied shipping space, which our torpedoes had wrested from only the smallest of convoys. On the evening of November the 26th, U-230 left the port of Brest for the last time. It followed in the wake of a minesweeper, passed through the net at the harbor entrance, navigated the narrow waterway leading to the Bay of Brest, and then swiftly headed into the open sea, heading south. Our departure had remained a well-guarded secret this time. The all-knowing English Radio channel Calais, which broadcast news in German, had no special greetings for our departure today. Only minutes later, the first enemy detection occurred. Our new radar warning receiver seemed to be functioning well. Instead of diving immediately, we stayed on the surface, increased speed, kept our 8 barrels ready for firing, and applied a new diversion tactic that, we were told, should be very effective. Heinz Riedel, tasked with handling the new system, filled a balloon with helium gas, which we carried in pressure-resistant bottles on the railing. He attached a long line with aluminum foils to the balloon, the loose end to a float, and then threw the peculiar bundle overboard astern. The float sat on the water, the balloon rose high, and the line with the foils stretched out to its full length. The decoy quickly disappeared into the darkness. Minutes later, Riedel repeated the throw with a second balloon, and a second Christmas tree floated through the dark waters of the Bay of Biscay. The aluminum foils were supposed to create a strong reflection on the enemy radar screen, stronger than that of our boat. They would allow us to disappear behind our own forest of aluminum trees. Unfortunately, 2 more aluminum lines got entangled in the railing and 3 balloons burst while Riedel filled them with gas. The confusion of tangled foils made our position even more apparent and posed an additional risk. But luck was with us again. While Riedel struggled with the foils and balloons, we entered a larger French fishing fleet. It provided more protection than the decoys and our cannons. We stowed the balloons and foils and never used them again. They were a danger, not a help. We zigzagged through the widely spaced fishing boats. For most of the night, we made excellent progress. Then we were alone again with the wind, the sea, and death waiting for us. But our new radar warning device, the so-called Wanze, worked reliably. Several times it detected incoming aircraft from a great distance, giving us enough time for a rapid dive into the protective depths. Each time, the Tommies were left confused in the air. Once the British realized that our new device was warning us again about their approaches, they changed their tactics. They flew up and down over our general course, attacking at well-calculated intervals to force us to dive at ever shorter intervals and prevent us from charging the batteries. In short, to starve us. The result of the first night, we had only charged our batteries to 70%. But we had learned that in our bug, which is what Wanze means in English, we had a reliable instrument that allowed us to dive in time to escape the bombing. Long after nightfall the next evening, we surfaced and continued our journey south. Instead of heading into the Valley of Death, we steered towards the northern coast of neutral Spain. That night, we dived for 3 detections without receiving the usual bomb greetings. During the daytime submerged march, Siegmann spoke to the crew over the loudspeaker system, informing them about our risky venture. The reactions were a mix of surprise and a cautious acceptance of the inevitable. The people had been through enough hell to know the rules of the game. There were also other foreseeable consequences. Many sailors had left a girl in Brest. Now they suddenly realized they wouldn't see her again, and the disappointment over the forced separation often surfaced decisively. During one of my rounds through the boat, I saw one of our torpedo technicians sitting on a bunk in the bow compartment, surrounded by his comrades. He held a bra and silk panties in his rough hands. His comrades did not spare explicit remarks. During our cautious approach to the Spanish coast, we passed the heavily damaged Lorient. In the next night, we had La Rochelle to port. When we spotted the lights of Saint-Sebastian, we surfaced, turned west, and followed the black silhouettes of the high mountains at a distance of about 4 nautical miles. Our cautious journey along the coast remained undiscovered. We alternatively marveled at the lights of Santander and Gijon, which shone across the dark nights, and circumnavigated Cape Finisterre on the 5th night. In the following night, we saw the glow of millions of lights in the night sky. Lisbon. While the citizens of the million-strong city indulged in their nightly pleasures or peacefully slumbered, we crossed the Bay of Lisbon. On the 8th day of our mission, we occasionally submerged to periscope depth and took bearings of Cape St. Vincent. As we surfaced on December the 5th, just before midnight, and steered into the Bay of Cadiz in the shadow of the land, Riedel climbed into the bridge to relieve me, saying, "There's an officer's radio message on the back in the officer's mess. Didn't have time to decrypt it. Can you take care of this? Must be something important." Riedel took my place behind the tower casing, and I descended into the darkness of the steel tube. Armed with the decryption materials, I sat at the back. However, the radio message had already been decrypted, and I read the leadership's congratulations on Riedel's and Werner's promotion to Oberleutnant. Soon after, we left Cadiz astern and cautiously set course for the concentrated English defense of the Strait of Gibraltar. On December the 6th, 2 hours past midnight, we entered the Bay of Barbade. This was the limit of our advancement on the European side of the strait. We submerged and grounded U-230. During the day, we heard the detonations of some depth charges a few miles away to the east. They made it clear that the Tommies were doing everything to thwart a breakthrough of submarines through their blockade. While most men slept, I sat with the captain in his small corner. Siegmann outlined his plan for breaking through the blockade. We considered countless possibilities. Then Siegmann decided to surface in front of the North African port city of Tangier and then submerge to push through from there. On the evening of December the 6th, the crew moved to battle stations and was instructed to remain at their posts for the next 3 days. At 9 p.m. we surfaced. The sea was smooth and sluggish, the night was moonless and windless. The tension on board was near breaking point. Then the 2 diesel engines howled and we pounded with utmost force towards the African coast. Above us, the black, clear sky was filled with stars, and as we shot out from the shelter of the Spanish coast, the radar detections hit us like glowing arrows. "Detection, strength 3. The cry cut through the night like shattering glass. We rushed into the tower and the boat immediately dropped. However, once the tumult of the alarm maneuver subsided, all was calm, no bumps. Encouraged, we surfaced again. 8 miles later, a persistent radar detection forced us back into the depths. At 2300 hours, we surfaced again, making a new sprint with all available horsepower. The diesel engines rang brightly, the exhausts roared, and the superchargers whooshed. We charged the batteries to full capacity, enough to sustain a 3-day silent run. U-230 plowed through a seemingly endless reflective expanse of water, creating a shimmering bow wave, whipping the water around our pressure hull into white spray and leaving a telltale foamy wake behind. Minute by minute we surged forward until the lights of Tangier became visible. Then we changed course to the east into the gap between the 2 continents. Soon we penetrated a flotilla of African fishing boats, zigzagging through the scattered vessels. Siegmann steered the boat close to the strait. 40 minutes later, we had left the unsuspecting fishermen behind, reaching the end of our surface journey. The radar detections became unbearably loud. To avoid tempting fate further, we dived. December the 7th. At 0042 hours, U-230 began its submerged journey into the depths. The boat was perfectly trimmed, silently gliding with minimal forward buoyancy, but with a slight upward tendency. The boat's speed through the water was set at 1.5 nautical miles, just enough to keep it neutrally buoyant. The current, estimated at 3 miles at our dive point, would lift our bottom speed to 4.5 miles. As we approached the strait, we expected an increase in the current into the Mediterranean, reaching a strength of 8 knots at the narrowest point. I settled into the control room. Kästner, our best sonar operator, soon picked up faint propeller noises and ASDIC detections. They all lie directly ahead. In between, he heard strange pulses that he had never encountered before. Friedrich was on depth watch. The commander sat at his desk, listening intently to Kästner's reports. I snuck into the listening room to study the phenomenon, put headphones over my ears, and listened. Alongside the familiar challenging ASDIC pulses, there was a bright chirping sound that, as Kästner claimed, seemed to come from a new underwater detection device used by the English. The pulses sounded like the squeaking and squealing of a rubber toy when squeezed. Suddenly, enlightenment dawned on me. This is not a new English trick, Kästner. These are dolphins communicating. Listen, you can even distinguish their voices. Fascinated, we listened to the conversation of numerous dolphins frolicking in the underwater currents. Some swam in front of the bow, while others gathered around our pressure hull. However, all seemed to have taken a liking to the giant fish that had apparently joined them to participate in their games. Their chatter increased as we penetrated deeper into the strait and the currents grew stronger. The same applied to the ASDIC pulses. However, when the first depth charges exploded, our companions fled out into the Atlantic. Above us, destroyers busily traced their nervous patterns. Their activity peaked around 10 o'clock and ASDIC pulses rained down like hail. But the swiftly moving water layers of different temperatures and densities formed a protective blanket over our boat. The destroyers, unable to make contact, resorted to their old game. They dropped depth charges randomly. At 12 o'clock, I took control of the diving control station. The Aztec pulses had subsided and shifted aft. It became increasingly clear that we had broken through the blockade, outsmarted the destroyers, and passed through the narrowest part of the Strait of Gibraltar. The general commotion of defense diminished, and at 4 o'clock, Siegmund's patience ran out. "Lieutenant, bring the boat to periscope depth. I want to see how far we've come. It should be interesting to see Europe and Africa in a single glance. Do you want to take a look too?" The commander swung into the periscope seat, turned it on its axis, and surveyed the immediate surroundings. Then he focused the glass eye on a point to port, turned to starboard, then back to port. Finally he said, "I almost believe, XO, we've already passed the rock. Let me see the sea handbook." I handed him the handbook of the Spanish coast, which contained an image of the rock of Gibraltar as seen from the sea. "Of course we've already passed it. We've made considerably more headway than assumed. Hey, Praga, take this down. I need some bearings." A few moments later, the chief helmsman gave us a more precise location. The result was surprising. We had already penetrated 7.5 nautical miles into the Mediterranean. A quick calculation revealed that we had made a speed of 14 knots over the ground at the narrowest point, with the current responsible for 12.5 miles. Siegmund left his seat, and I swung into it, pointing the periscope at the Rock of Gibraltar, shimmering from the green water into the azure sky. Through the low-lying haze, I counted at least 6 warships, destroyers, guarding the entrance to the Mediterranean. I turned the periscope eye to starboard, and the North African coast almost vertically emerged from the sea. On the high cliffs of Ceuta stood a slender war memorial, a tribute to the fallen in the Spanish Civil War. The coast on both sides of the monument dissolved in the afternoon's air haze. I was fascinated by the view, and almost spotted the aircraft too late. "Dive the boat," I quickly called. "Down to 60 meters, aircraft approaching." I retracted the long shaft of the periscope, pulled my head between my shoulders, and waited. But U-230 arrived at the ordered depth without bombs. I relieved Friedrich at the depth control and also took on his task of noting the number of exploding depth charges, purely out of curiosity. The boat was enveloped in a wonderful silence. The risk of being detected decreased with every mile. At 10 o'clock, the small lamp in the commander's niche was extinguished for the first time in 12 days, and the dark green curtain was drawn in front of his bunk. Almost 24 hours later, at 9:30 p.m., the following night, U-230 surfaced. We had the lights of Malaga directly ahead. The dark mountains behind the illuminated city loomed bizarrely against the pale night sky. The night was so mild that I quickly took off my leather jacket. The diesels began to hum again, and U-230 followed the Black Mountain Range to the east. We ventilated the boat, started charging the batteries, disposed of waste overboard, and sent our first radio message to High Command. It said, "Special mission fulfilled. Request new instructions. U-230. We were prepared for our signal to provoke vigorous enemy countermeasures within an hour. However, the night remained calm. Just before dawn, we received the reply. It said, "Well done. Proceed immediately to Toulon. Special precautions advised near Toulon. Enemy submarines possible. Signed, Dönitz." We had expected to engage in a fierce battle with the Allies who conducted active supply operations between North African ports and the occupied southern Italian coast. Disrupting this trade and thereby relieving pressure on our Italian front was supposed to be the main task of our mission. Therefore, I couldn't understand the leadership's order that directed us to the port of Toulon. The thought that we were designated for a new special task, which demanded a briefing, was pressing itself upon us. So, with an upgraded boat our boy is at it again, and with a special mission to boot. Breaking through Gibraltar was extremely dangerous, and you all have seen the attempt in Das Boot, where they get damaged so heavily that they have to abort the attempt and return to France. But again, in our case, Herbert is lucky, and they make it, and this time even without incident. Interesting things to note in this episode: we learn about the technological advances on the German side. U-230 has had the so-called bug installed, which is called this way because the German military abbreviation almost matches the German word for bug, which is Wanze. It is a system that worked very well, as you've heard. The other is the gas-filled balloon with aluminium strips to bamboozle enemy radar. This system was widespread by 1943 and was called Aphrodite. Unfortunately, I couldn't find pictures of either, so you just have to believe me, I guess. Anyway, a new special mission awaits and we will learn about it in the next episode. Until then, cheers and bye-bye.